Darkness, cold, endless, and unyielding. The void stretched in every direction, broken only by the eerie glow of shattered warships drifting lifelessly through the abyss. Burnt-out hulls, torn metal, and frozen bodies, once the proud defenders of Earth, floated in silent testimony to the catastrophe that had unfolded. Fires still flickered in the ruptured remains of what had once been the pride of the Terran defense fleet. Some of these ships had names that carried history. The TSS Midway, named after the ancient naval battle that had turned the tide of war centuries ago. The Indomitable, a vessel that had once stood defiant against impossible odds. The Gagarin's Dream, an exploratory cruiser repurposed for war, now reduced to little more than a floating tomb. The names no longer mattered. Nothing did, not to the dead. Above, the invaders loomed. The Xal'Zoran Armada hung in high orbit, their warships vast, sleek, and utterly untouched by the battle. Their hulls pulsed with eerie blue energy, a technology that defied human understanding, allowing them to slice through the void like predators through water. Every ship bore the insignia of the Galactic Imperium, a vast and ancient dominion that had conquered more than 1,000 species across the stars. This was routine for them. Another world subdued, another civilization that dared to defy their rule, crushed beneath the weight of inevitability. On the command deck of the Zarathos, the Imperium's flagship, Supreme Warlord Velix stood motionless before the grand viewport. He was tall, his exoskeletal armor gleaming in the cold artificial light of the bridge. His elongated face bore the marks of an apex predator, sharp ridges, silvered eyes, and a mouth filled with needle-like teeth hidden behind the ceremonial mask of his station. He had seen this before: resistance, defiance, then surrender. He had watched countless species fall beneath the Imperium's might. Some had crumbled in days, others had fought for years before succumbing to the inevitable. But in the end they all fell. The humans would be no different. Still, and something gnawed at the edges of his mind, a whisper of unease, a shadow of doubt. Velix turned his gaze to his second-in-command, a battle-scarred warrior named Kirill Voss. The lieutenant stood rigid, his silvered eyes sharp and calculating. "Are there any remaining human forces capable of resistance?" Voss hesitated. "None that we can detect, Supreme Warlord." His voice was steady, but there was something else there, something uncertain. "Their planetary defenses are offline. Their remaining warships are either disabled or destroyed. The Sol system is ours." Velix exhaled slowly, letting the silence stretch between them. It was too easy. Humans were reckless, undisciplined, primitive by Imperial standards. And yet, they were also dangerous. He had studied their history. Unlike the other species they had conquered, humans did not break when beaten. They did not surrender when outmatched. No, humans did something far worse. They adapted. They retaliated. They struck back from the shadows, from the wreckage, from the depths of their own destruction, and that made them unpredictable. He watched the planet below, the blue and green sphere now held captive beneath his fleet. Even from here he could see the scars forming, plumes of smoke from devastated cities, the smoldering remnants of orbital bombardments. Entire continents lay in ruin, and yet he felt no satisfaction. Victory was supposed to feel different. "Begin final occupation procedures," he ordered at last. "Deploy the ground forces. Secure the key population centers. Make it clear that resistance is—" A soft chime interrupted him. The sound was small, insignificant, but it set his nerves on edge. A weak transmission had slipped through the vast jamming fields placed around Earth. It was faint, almost imperceptible, hidden among the ruins of human communication networks. The Imperium had shattered their satellites, burned their defenses, erased their ability to cry for help. So how had this signal gotten through? Velix gestured, and the signal was decrypted. It carried no plea for mercy, no surrender, no request for aid. It carried only 3 words, encoded in an ancient human cipher, one used in wars long before the Imperium had even known Earth existed. Operation Revenant, commence. Silence filled the command deck. Even the officers who had no Understanding of human language felt something shift in the air. Valix clenched his jaw. He turned to Voss, his voice a low growl. Find out what that means. Now. Deep beneath the surface of Mars, in the last surviving military bunker of the Terran Defense Corps, a figure watched as the message was received. The underground facility, once a classified outpost for planetary defense, had now become the last refuge for humanity's war command. The room was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of sweat, blood, and desperation. Commander Elias Cade stood at the center, staring at the screen as the transmission confirmation flashed. His uniform was torn, smeared with the grime of battle. His face was lined with exhaustion, yet in his eyes there was something else. Something primal. Something the Xal'Zoran warlords did not yet understand. Cade exhaled slowly, stepping forward. Around him, the last remnants of humanity's strategic command waited silent. Engineers, tacticians, soldiers, all that remained of Earth's fighting spirit. They think we're beaten, Cade said, his voice quiet, controlled. He reached for the sidearm strapped to his belt, sliding it into place. They think Earth is defenseless. He turned, meeting the eyes of each soldier, each officer, each survivor who had made it this far. They think this war is over. A slow, grim smile spread across his face. They're about to learn just how wrong they are. Mars had always been called the second home of humanity. It was the first planet humans had truly conquered beyond Earth, a world reshaped by their stubborn will and unyielding ambition. Over centuries, it had been transformed into a thriving colony, a testament to human ingenuity. Cities had been carved into its dust-ridden surface, domes had risen over vast terraformed landscapes, and beneath the iron-rich soil, deep underground, lay something the Xal'Zoran had overlooked. The last ember of human resistance. Commander. Elias Cade stepped through the war room, his boots echoing against the reinforced alloy floors. Holographic displays cast a cold blue glow across the chamber, outlining Earth, the wreckage above it, and the enemy fleet in painstaking detail. The Terran Defense Corps, what little of it remained, stood around him, hardened survivors of a war that should have ended hours ago, but it hadn't. Major Ren Nakamura, his second in command, stood by the central console, arms crossed. A scar ran down the left side of her face, a brutal reminder of the day Earth's orbital stations had fallen. "I assume we're not just going to sit here and watch?" she asked, her voice sharp, cutting through the tension. Cade's expression was unreadable. "No," he said, "we're going to show them what happens when they think they've already won." A low murmur swept through the room. These people had lost everything. Families, homes, entire lives obliterated in an instant. And yet, here, they were standing not as the defeated, but as the architects of vengeance. Colonel Isaac Vance, an older officer whose experience dated back to the first skirmishes with the Imperium, leaned forward. "Revenant," he muttered. "I assume you're serious?" Cade met his gaze. "We planned for this," he said. "Maybe not in exact detail, but we always knew something like this could happen. We've studied the Imperium. We knew they'd come eventually, and they made the mistake of thinking we had nothing left." Nakamura tapped a control panel, bringing up the underground schematics of Mars. "Revenant was never just a failsafe," she said. "It was a contingency for exactly this moment." Across the bunker, engineers and technicians worked frantically. Heavy doors hissed open, revealing the weapons humanity had hidden beneath Mars for decades. Experimental railgun platforms, kinetic bombardment satellites, and stealth-class strike craft that had never seen combat. Prototype technology, untested. In real battle, designed in secret after the first contact wars, the Imperium had underestimated humanity's willingness to fight to the bitter end. Cade turned toward the team. "The Xal'Zoran are sitting in orbit, thinking they've crushed us. They're wrong. We still have ground-to-space weapons hidden in this facility, enough to cripple their fleet if we time it right. We also have the Black Veil." At the mention of the name, a hushed silence fell over the room. The Black Veil, a ship that officially didn't exist. It had been humanity's ace in the hole for years, an experimental warship designed for one purpose: to strike from the shadows. Unlike the lumbering behemoths the Xal'Zoran had destroyed, the Black Veil was something else entirely. Cloaked in an advanced optical disruption field, its hull composed of radiation-dampening alloys, it could drift between the stars unseen, a ghost in the void. Vance exhaled. "You want to deploy the Veil? That thing hasn't been field-tested. If the cloak fails—" Cade cut him off. "If we do nothing, we're already dead." Nakamura nodded. "We send the Black Veil up first. Have it infiltrate the enemy fleet while we prepare a full-scale counterattack from the ground. If the ship gets into position, we can use their own arrogance against them." Cade's eyes darkened. "They think we're out of moves. Let's make them regret that assumption." He turned back to the room, locking eyes with every soul still willing to fight. "Revenant is in motion. This is our last chance. Either we strike now, or humanity fades into the ashes of history." "No." One hesitated. No one backed down. Orders were issued, systems brought online, final checks confirmed. Within minutes, the Black Veil was primed for launch, buried deep within the catacombs beneath Mars. Its engines hummed silently, awaiting the command. And then, across the ruined system, something changed, because while the Xal'Zoran thought they had won deep in the void, something unseen stirred in the darkness. Humanity had not been defeated. Humanity had become the predator. The void between Mars and Earth was silent. The debris of shattered ships drifted aimlessly, remnants of humanity's last stand. But beneath the ruin, beneath the illusion of defeat, something moved. The Black Veil slipped from its underground cradle with eerie precision. The launch was nearly imperceptible. No grand thrusters, no burning light against the blackness. It was designed to be a ghost, its surface coated in optical distortion plating that bent light away, rendering it nearly invisible to the naked eye, to radar, to thermal scans. To the enemy's advanced sensor suites, the Black Veil did not exist. Inside, the crew worked in complete silence, their breathing shallow, their movements calculated. Every person on board knew the stakes. One misstep, one accidental energy spike, and the Imperium's fleet would erase them before they could act. Commander Elias Cade stood on the bridge, eyes locked onto the holographic display of the Xal'Zoran fleet. The enemy armada floated over Earth like a wall of gods, massive vessels pulsing with eerie blue light. No, not gods, arrogant tyrants. And tonight, the gods would bleed. "Status," Cade murmured. Lieutenant Zara Holt, the ship's lead, infiltration officer, barely glanced away from her console. Her fingers glided over the control panels, monitoring a dozen subsystems at once. Cloak holding steady, radiation levels mimicking local space, no energy fluctuations. They have no idea we're here. Cade exhaled slowly. "Good. Let's get into position." The Black Veil drifted like a shadow between the enemy vessels. Enormous Xal'Zoran warships loomed overhead, each one a city-sized fortress of metal and death. These were the ships that had destroyed Earth's defenses in mere hours, but now they were unwitting sentinels, standing over their own executioner. Cade's voice remained calm, but his hands clenched behind his back. Targeting priority, the Zirathos. The command deck of the Zirathos, the Imperium's flagship, was bathed in the cold glow of star charts and battle data. Supreme Warlord Valix stood at the center, his mind deep in calculation. Something was wrong. The humans should have surrendered. They should have been begging for mercy, their leaders scrambling to negotiate terms. And yet, there was silence. "It was unnatural, Voss," he said quietly. His second-in-command turned, standing at attention. "Supreme Warlord. The signal we intercepted. Has any progress been made in deciphering its significance?" Voss hesitated. "The phrase Operation Revenant does not match any known human transmissions we've studied. However, it was sent from an undisclosed location beneath the Martian surface." Valix's fingers tapped against the hilt of his ceremonial dagger. "A habit. A sign of thought. Mars," he mused. "The humans are resourceful. If any survivors remained, Mars would be their best fallback." "Position." His silvered eyes narrowed. Order a deep space scan of the Martian underground. Find out what they're hiding. Voss nodded. But before he could carry out the order, the flagship shuddered. It was almost imperceptible, just the faintest vibration through the hull. But Valix felt it. He turned sharply. "Report," one of the bridge officers blinked in. Confusion analyzing sensor data. "My lord, there's nothing, no impacts, no weapons fire, but something—" The ship shuddered again. This time stronger. Then alarms, bright red symbols flooded the screens, incomprehensible at first, then forming a pattern so absurd it took the crew a moment to register the truth. The Zerathos was under attack, from inside its own fleet. Valix's eyes widened as he watched the impossible unfold. One of their own ships had suddenly surged forward, its hull erupting with unseen kinetic energy. At first it seemed like a system failure, then another vessel did the same, and another. The Xal'Zoran fleet, an armada that had stood unchallenged in 1,000 battles, was suddenly tearing itself apart. And still, there were no visible enemies, no human ships. No launch signatures, nothing. And then the transmissions began, unencrypted, clear. Human voices flooded the command decks of every Xal'Zoran warship. "You thought we were dead. You thought Earth was finished. You were wrong. Deep." Beneath Mars, in the hidden war room of the Terran Defense Corps, Major Ren Nakamura grinned. "It's working," she confirmed. "The Black Veil has hacked into their internal systems. We've turned their own fleet against them." Cade stood, beside her, arms folded. "Good," he said. "But it's not enough." Vance frowned. "You want to hit them harder?" Cade nodded. "We need to make them afraid." He turned toward the room full of technicians. "Deploy the kinetic rods." A quiet murmur spread through the bunker. The kinetic bombardment rods, nicknamed God Spears by the engineers who designed them, had never been used before. Each one was a tungsten cylinder, the size of a small car accelerated to hypersonic speeds from orbit. No explosives, no energy payloads, just pure mass and velocity. A weapon designed to hit with the force of a nuclear bomb, without the radiation, the jaw. Moment the order was given, hidden launch stations on Mars came online. Their existence had been unknown to the Imperium, buried deep beneath the red sands. Now they awoke. High above, several rods detached from their cradles and began their descent toward the Xal'Zoran fleet. Valix saw them too late. The first rod struck a battle cruiser on the outskirts of the armada. The ship crumpled in an instant, its entire midsection folding inward, as metal shattered and flames erupted from within. The force was indescribable. The ship didn't explode. It collapsed under its own weight, debris scattering into the void. Like a ruptured artery, then the second rod hit, then the third. Panic spread through the Imperium fleet. Cade watched from the Mars command center, his expression cold. "They underestimated us," he said. "Now they'll learn what that costs." On the Black Veil, Zara Holt turned to Cade's image on the holoscreen. "We've infiltrated their comms. They're already breaking formation. The Warlord's flagship is attempting to retreat." Cade exhaled. Not yet. For the first time since the invasion had begun, the tide was turning. Humanity was no longer the hunted. Now, they were the storm. Supreme Warlord Valix had commanded hundreds of battles. He had conquered civilizations that had stood for millennia, reduced defiant worlds to smoldering ruin. He had faced desperation before, had watched species fight to the bitter end, clinging to the last shreds of their existence. But never like this. Never had the prey turned the hunt against the hunter so completely. The Zerathos trembled beneath his feet as another kinetic rod slammed into a nearby warship. The Varlosk, a behemoth of the Imperium's fleet, fractured in two, its artificial gravity generators failing in a spectacular burst of uncontrolled energy. Crew members were flung into space, their bodies tumbling helplessly before vanishing into the void. Valix's jaw tightened as he turned to his command crew. "Break formation, now." Voss, his second-in-command, struggled to maintain composure. "We're trying, Supreme Warlord, but—" The ship jolted violently. Systems flickered. The lights dimmed for a fraction of a second before emergency power kicked in. Valix slammed a fist against the command panel. What was that? The chief systems officer, Her crest of violet chitin, trembling with fear, glanced at the data stream in horror. "It's the humans, my lord. They've overridden our fleet's AI protocols." Valix turned sharply. Impossible. But the truth was undeniable. The evidence scrolled across the holodisplay in front of him. Battle cruisers, firing on their own escorts. Defense systems turning inward, targeting their own thrusters. Command signals being drowned out by a digital storm of human-crafted code. The Imperium's fleet, once the hammer of the stars, was collapsing. Valix's mind raced. How? The humans didn't have the technological sophistication to do this. They were brutes, savages who relied on raw force and desperate tactics. And yet here they were, twisting the Imperium's own weapons against them with terrifying precision. They had been waiting for this. The realization struck like a blade through his chest. The humans had planned for an invasion. They had anticipated defeat, and then they had set the perfect trap. It wasn't just the Black Veil, it wasn't just the hidden weapon caches beneath Mars. It was a war they had already begun before the Imperium had fired its first shot. A transmission came through the Imperium fleet's comm channels, unencrypted, brazen. Supreme Warlord Valix. The voice was unmistakably human, calm, controlled, and utterly devoid of fear. Valix's throat tightened. "Who speaks?" A moment of silence, then, "Commander Elias Cade, Terran Defense Corps." The name meant nothing to him. A minor figure, a survivor of a doomed world, a ghost speaking from the ashes of his people. And yet, there was power in the way he spoke. "You made a mistake, Valix." Valix bared his teeth. "The only mistake was allowing your kind to survive long enough to speak." There was no anger in Cade's reply, only cold certainty. "You assumed humanity would fall like the others, that we would crumble beneath the weight of your empire, that we would kneel. We don't kneel." The Zirathos rocked again as another ship was torn apart by its own automated defenses. The fleet's formation was unraveling, a once impenetrable wall of warships reduced to a chaotic, flailing mass. And then came the final blow. Cade's voice dropped lower, almost a whisper. "You forgot one thing about humanity." Valix clenched his fists, trying to steady himself. "And what is that?" "We learn." Across the battlefield, the Black Veil activated the final phase of its infiltration. Deep within the Zirathos, hidden beneath layers of security, the ship's primary reactor cores pulsed with energy, controlled by a system that the humans had just rewritten. One command. That was all it took. Deep within the flagship, an emergency signal tripped the automated containment failsafe. The ship's fusion core, normally protected by 1,000 layers of redundancy, suddenly found itself exposed to a false, catastrophic failure. The safety overrides disengaged. On every console aboard the Zirathos, a single red warning flashed. "Core. Breach imminent." Valix felt the blood drain from his face. No. The bridge erupted into chaos. Officers shouted over one another, scrambling to contain the catastrophe unfolding beneath them. It was too late. A bright, terrible light consumed the viewport as the Zirathos, the Imperium's pride, its symbol of dominance, detonated. The explosion was monstrous, a white-hot inferno of energy and debris ripping outward, consuming everything in its path. A dozen nearby ships were caught in the blast, their hulls buckling, their crews incinerated in an instant. The shockwave thundered through the void, scattering the remaining Xal'Zoran forces like leaves in a storm. For the first time in his life, Supreme Warlord Valix felt true, undeniable fear. The humans had not merely resisted, they had outmaneuvered him. They had used the Imperium's own arrogance, their own weapons, their own fleet, against them. Humanity had turned their annihilation into a war of extinction, and they were winning. Silence. A silence so vast, so absolute, that for a brief moment it felt as though the entire cosmos had paused to witness what had just occurred. The flagship of the Xal'Zoran Imperium, the Zirathos, was gone, reduced to nothing but a searing cloud of debris and ionized metal. The shockwave still rippled outward, distorting space itself as it passed through the remains of what had once been an unstoppable fleet. For a long moment, Supreme Warlord Valix could only stare at the devastation through the reinforced viewport of his emergency command vessel, the Vorkal. The stars beyond flickered behind the drifting wreckage of his armada, the once pristine formations now a shattered ruin of broken hulls and silent death. A single human ship, a mere phantom, had done this. It was inconceivable, and yet here it was. Survivor reports? Valix's voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. A trembling officer checked the holo readouts. The display was a chaotic mess of static and incomplete transmissions. Finally, she managed a reply. Only 30% of the fleet remains operational, Supreme Warlord. The words struck like a hammer. 30%, 70% of his invasion force gone. Valix's mandibles clicked together in frustration, his mind racing. The Imperium had never suffered losses on this scale before. Not in a single battle. Not against a single species. Not against humans. He had underestimated them. That much was undeniable. Their primitive, brute force military tactics had been a lie. A mask. And beneath that mask, they had been watching, waiting, adapting. They had played him. The pieces were falling into place now. The human countermeasures, the disruption of their fleet's AI, the kinetic strikes timed with such devastating precision. This had not been a desperate, last-stand retaliation. This had been a plan. His eyes narrowed. But a plan required an architect. "Open a direct channel," Valix ordered. The comms officer hesitated. "To whom, my lord?" Valix turned his gaze toward the void beyond, where the black veil still lurked, silent, unseen, but undeniably present. "To Commander Elias Cade." The bridge crew exchanged nervous glances, but they obeyed. Within seconds a connection was established, then a voice. Calm, controlled. "Go ahead, Warlord." Valix's mandibles tightened. He could hear it in Cade's tone. The certainty, the quiet confidence of a man who already knew the outcome of this battle. A human who had bested him. He forced his voice to remain steady. "I see now that I miscalculated. Your species is more resourceful than I had believed." A pause. Then Cade spoke. "Is that the part where you offer terms?" Valix felt his pride burn. The thought of negotiating with a lesser species was unthinkable. The Imperium did not negotiate. They did not bargain with the conquered. They imposed order. But what if the conqueror was no longer in control? His mind raced through the possibilities. Could he still win this war? If he called for reinforcements, they would take time to arrive, time he did not have, and if the humans had devised this level of retaliation in secret, what else were they? Hiding? Could he risk more? Valix's silence was answer enough. Cade exhaled softly. "I'll take that as a no." Then his voice darkened. "In that case, let me tell you how this ends." From the Martian war room, Cade stood before the holographic display of the battlefield. His eyes traced the scattered remnants of the Imperium's once invincible fleet, calculating, deciding. "They'll write songs about this, Warlord," Cade continued, his voice quiet, measured. "The day the great Xal'Zoran Imperium thought they could break Earth. The day they learned what happens when humanity is backed against a wall." Cade took a step closer to the display. The black veil had already moved into position for the final strike. The surviving Terran forces, once thought to be nothing more than the remnants of a shattered race, were now the executioners of an empire's arrogance. "You came here thinking we were weak." Outside, more kinetic rods detached from there. Hidden launch stations. A second barrage aimed directly at the remaining Xal'Zoran command vessels. "You thought we were afraid." The black veil unleashed its final virus into the fleet's network. A kill code, one that would permanently sever the Xal'Zoran's AI coordination, leaving every ship stranded, every automated system locked in disarray. "You thought Earth was defenseless." The kinetic rods struck. Ships crumpled like paper, their hulls folding inward, as the sheer force of the impacts shattered their structures at the molecular level. Explosions bloomed like dying stars, silent but terrible in their destruction. Supreme Warlord Valix could only watch. Humanity had done more than resist. They had turned survival into annihilation. And now, the Imperium's once invincible fleet was burning in the blackness of space. Cade's voice came through one final time, cutting through the static. "Run." For the first time in recorded history, the Xal'Zoran Imperium fled a battlefield. Valix's remaining ships, crippled, leaderless, engaged emergency jump drives, vanishing into the void with no formation, no honor, just desperation. The battle for Earth was over, but the war had just begun. The stars were quiet now, where once the heavens had roared with the fury of battle, where once fire and destruction had danced across the void, only silence remained. Wreckage drifted in the darkness, twisted hulls, shattered command centers, the lifeless remains of what had been the pride of the Xal'Zoran Imperium. And amidst the wreckage, Earth still stood. Commander Elias Cade leaned against the command console of the Black Veil, his muscles aching with exhaustion, his mind still sharp, still running through every tactical possibility. Victory had been secured, this battle at least, but war was a beast that never truly died. The Xal'Zoran would return, that much was certain, but next time it would not be an invasion. It would be vengeance. He turned to Admiral Riker, who stood beside him, watching the fleet data scroll across the holodisplay. The Admiral exhaled, rubbing his temples. "Hell of a first strike, Cade." Cade smirked, though there was no humor in it. "We gave them a history lesson." Riker chuckled dryly. "Yeah? What kind?" Cade turned his gaze to the viewport, where the remnants of the Xal'Zoran fleet had vanished into the void, running like wounded beasts. He spoke softly. "Never start a war with Earth." A transmission broke through the silence, static-filled, weak, but unmistakably alien. A voice that had once commanded fear now carried only bitter resignation. "Commander Cade, Supreme Warlord Valix." Cade glanced at Riker, then gave a nod. The transmission was patched through. "You may have won today," Valix rasped, his voice frayed at the edges. "But you have not won the war. You do not know the wrath of the Imperium. You do not understand the tide you have unleashed." Cade's grip on the console tightened. "Then come back," he said coolly. "See what happens." Silence on the other end. The Xal'Zoran did not bluff. They did not retreat in disgrace. And yet, here they were. Finally, Valix spoke again. "You should have perished." Cade let out a slow breath. "Yeah," he said. "But we didn't." Another pause. Then, Valix's voice dropped to something colder, something deeper. "Next time, there will be no mistakes." The transmission cut out. Riker muttered, "Dramatic bastard." Cade exhaled sharply, rubbing his jaw. He knew what that call had been. Not a surrender, not a warning. A promise. The Imperium would be back. Stronger, angrier, smarter. And that was fine, because so would humanity. He straightened and turned to the holomap, already seeing the next battle unfolding in his mind. The war had begun, but it was far from over. If Earth was to survive, humanity could not simply defend. They had to strike first. "Cade." He turned. Riker was watching him carefully. "Orders." For a moment the commander said nothing. Then, quietly, with the weight of a world behind his voice, he gave the only order that made sense. "Prepare." The fleet. Humanity had been hunted. Now it was time to become the hunters. The stars were quiet once more, but the silence would not last, for war was coming, and this time, Earth would strike first.